left to right. Therefore, this within this task, autism seems to be a bit of a protective factor for these sort of skills. It is the opposite on the right-hand side. This was a visual memory task. This is something that for autistic individuals, we would typically view as a skill set that is going to be intact, if not a bit more advanced. And we see the opposite here. What this task asked individuals to do was to look at 5 different geometrical figures for 10 seconds. Following this, they were asked to reproduce those geometrical figures immediately and then after a 20-minute delay. And as we look at the trend lines here, you'll see that the autistic group started at a more advanced skill level, but also then as we move across the age range into higher ages, we see more of an impact of aging on the level of skill that is demonstrated. And so this is one of the few studies that has been conducted that has specifically looked at that idea of how does autism interplay with our understanding of the effects of aging on the brain, and that idea that depending on the skill we are looking at, it seems to, in some areas, have a bit of a protective factor or not as much impact, whereas others, especially those where skills are relatively intact or advanced, we see the aging process have much more of an impact on skill level over time. Let's get into talking about some core fundamentals of effective support strategies before we close with any questions that you may have. When it comes to positive behavior support, which often stems first from that behavioral science arena, that 3-term contingency of antecedent, behavior, and consequence, we can also align ourselves with the idea of providing support or intervention at any of these 3 or even all of these 3 stages. With antecedent-based intervention, we can focus on how do we try to prevent challenging behavior from occurring in the first place, or how can we equip individuals with information or skills that allow them to be successful from the get-go. When it comes to behaviors, oftentimes we need to find replacement behaviors to teach that allow for a more adaptive sort of skill in replace of something that may be a bit more maladaptive. And when it comes to consequence strategies, how we address behaviors when they occur, a focus on reinforcement over punishment, but I also emphasize responding rather than reacting, because when we have a plan, when we have a thoughtful response, that is different from when we are just reactive and operating on our intuition or our best guess or previous behavior. It is critical to think through each stage of this equation as we are seeking to provide effective positive behavior support. The other thing I want to touch on is the prompting hierarchy, the idea we can provide different levels of prompting and assistance and redirection, and different individuals will have different needs. But inherently, as we move from top to bottom, our prompting support becomes more invasive and inherently restricts someone's level of independence. So there are times, and I've myself provided support to individuals who may need physical prompting. But if we can avoid it, or if it is not needed, We only want to use the most intrusive form of support that is needed. The reason, though, that I often like to reference this is because it really helps to illustrate why visual supports are so important. Most people with autism are much more visual thinkers and learners. So on one hand, visual supports just align with many natural tendencies that they may have. But more so, what I want to point out here is other than someone being completely independent, the only other option on this hierarchy that doesn't necessitate another human being directly involved and present is visual support. If I want to gesture, if I want to model, if I want to give a verbal or physical prompt, I have to be there in order to do so. I think we can all agree that one of our top goals for any individual we are supporting is maximizing their independence, their self-determination, centering their own perspective. But also, if someone needs support, if the only way that I'm able to provide it is being there, inherently those will restrict those sort of goals. If I can provide some sort of visual support, what that allows me to do as a support provider is, as I am physically present, rather than cueing them, prompting them, giving them directives directly, I can actually cue them to the visual. And over time, as they develop skills, they go through repetition, they work on things, at some point I may be able to step back, to maybe even remove myself, to fade that interpersonal support without completely pulling the rug out from under them, so to speak. I can leave that visual support in place while also removing myself. And so in addition to visuals aligning with the natural skills and tendencies of autistic individuals, they are also critically important because they allow us, as we are able to give them heightened levels of independence without completely removing the support that is available. Let's circle back to some of those strategies and suggestions for adjusting your language and interaction style. We talked about using language that tends to be more simple, clear, and literal. We also want to focus on positive expectations. So what I mean by that is emphasizing what to do rather than what not to do. And especially if you are going to tell someone what not to do, to be specific in saying, here's what I want you to do instead. We talked about giving that additional weight and processing time. If we give someone a directive that is the outcome, we may need to step back and break tasks down into smaller steps. If I tell someone to go get dressed, that involves them potentially going to a different room, finding or selecting different parts of an outfit, putting it on themselves with or without assistance. If I say go get dressed and they don't initiate, sometimes we may assume they are refusing or being non-compliant. It also could be I haven't given them the information that's needed to allow them to go through a series of smaller steps to reach that sort of outcome. Once again, I can definitely do that interpersonally, but I also can create some sort of visual tool to reference that will allow them to have that support as needed, even if I am not there. We can offer different choices to help promote decision-making, especially if you ask a very open-ended, subjective question. What do you want to do? What do you want to have for lunch? There are reasons why autistic individuals may have challenges in generating an idea, an outcome related to executive functioning, and or being able to communicate that to you. But if we can offer choices, especially visually, that allows them to make a decision, but also centers their preference, their autonomy, versus me just making those choices for them. And I'll give you some ideas of how written or visual communication can play out, but at its core, keep in mind what we mean by visual is just some sort of concrete representation, not having it just be all mental or verbal. It can be words, it can be pictures. I'll give some specific visuals we may use to work on specific skills, but just because you don't have something pre-prepared does not mean that you can't utilize that sort of strategy. And before we move to those examples, the last strategy that is very language-based I want to share with you is a first-then statement or a first-then contingency. I have 2 young children, and neither of which are autistic, but I use this strategy with them quite frequently. First, you have to pick up your toys, then we can go outside. First, you have to eat your dinner, then you can have dessert. It allows them to know what to anticipate, what to expect. It is a very predictable way of communicating. It also can be very useful if you need someone to do something that is for a purpose or to their benefit that they may be a bit resistant to. First, I need you to take your medication, then we can talk about your high interest area. First, we need to go to the doctor, but then we can stop by the park. It's a very simple strategy that can be very effective for providing support to many different sorts of individuals. Here are examples of tools that we may use to address some of the things we talked about earlier. The 5-point scale here on the left-hand side is how we often teach or navigate things related to that emotional awareness or emotional regulation. We attach these things to something that is very visual, very concrete. We can work towards inserting emotional terminology, but for many, it's often easier to start with something more akin to a color or a number. There's a very similar sort of tool called the zones of regulation. That is a bit of a 4-point scale or model. If 5 different levels of differentiation is too much, we can easily adapt this to a 3-point scale, that traffic light model of go, slow down, stop. But we try to use this in a very proactive, preventative way of trying to minimize individuals reaching that peak level of escalation or anxiety, where we lose our ability to control our words, our actions. We may do things that are unsafe or damage relationships. We try to teach these skills and abilities to catch that at lower levels and recover before reaching that peak meltdown. On the right-hand side, this is the relationship circles or the circles curriculum. This is how we can help to teach or navigate some of those interpersonal boundaries. Someone that goes in public and may be very quick to want to hug or embrace a stranger. That is an unsafe situation. It also violates some of our social expectations. We can use this sort of visual tool to be very direct and explicit about identifying people that might be family or friends, who it is okay to give a hug if they are interested. But there are other people that we should stick to a wave, a high five, maybe no contact whatsoever. Once again, this is a very visual, concrete sort of tool that we can use to navigate those discussions and conversations. Someone else may be very quick to jump from, I met you for the first time, to we are now best friends. Once again, that is an unsafe situation. that puts someone in a situation where they may be victimized or taken advantage of. So when it comes to talking about who can I give a phone number, an address, any sort of financial information, this is once again the sort of tool that we can use to navigate those discussions. It also can be very applicable to topics of conversation. Someone with autism may not pick up on the social nuances that making small talk with a stranger, we oftentimes don't get into things related to politics or opinions or sharing personal information. Let's identify who are people you can go to if you do want to have those sort of conversations, but also if someone is more of an acquaintance or someone you are meeting for the first time, what are some conversation starters or some topics that they could use to initiate a conversation that will be more socially expected? The weather, sports, food, those are very common things that many of us know is where we should start from. Once again, you probably weren't ever necessarily taught that directly. You learned that through your previous experiences and observations. But again, even if you don't have something such as these, a pen and a pad, a whiteboard and a marker have been just as effective for me as some of these other more thought out, more pre-prepared sort of ideas. So use what you have at your disposal to get at that core of finding ways to make things visual. A few other ideas and examples. On the left-hand side here, this is that idea of task analysis. So breaking things down into smaller steps. And especially amidst COVID, this is very common now in our communities. COVID, if we could find one sort of silver lining to it, has shown us that visual supports can be just as effective for non-autistic people as they are for autistics, whether that is a task analysis, whether it is some sort of sticker dot on the floor telling you where to stand to keep yourself 6 feet apart. Those are things can be effective for everyone, but once again, when they are not there, some but not all of us are able to navigate those sort of things effectively. Excuse me. COVID has definitely demonstrated that idea of universal design, that there is no harm done by having those things in place within our community, but there is harm done when they are not available to those that may need them. Here's an example of that concept of offering choices. But I always like to joke that if you Google autism choice board, you're going to probably see something such as this that looks like it was made for a 6-year-old from the 90s. There's no reason that it has to look that way. I know many autistic adults who could utilize resources or tools such as this, but if I were to provide them with something akin to this, they probably would not be very happy with me. This would come across as a bit belittling, demeaning, etc. And so once again, keep in mind at its core, but also what are the needs and the preferences of the individual you are supporting. They may not need this kind of clip art stock image, they may just need a written list. It's unfortunate that for some reason we have this mindset of individuals with autism going all through school, having access to these things, but then they reach some sort of default age and we think, well, they no longer need that, which often isn't the case. Or now that they're an adult, I shouldn't provide this. They should learn to do without. And those are false goal lines that we can set for ourselves. So keep in mind at its core, this can be just as useful for adults as it may be for children, They may not need to look identical in order for it to be effective. Finally, in the middle here, we have a time timer, or just the idea that time can be a very abstract concept. If someone needs to do something that is less than preferred, we can set a boundary or limit so that they don't feel this is going to be indefinite or go forever. Likewise, maybe they are doing something that is highly preferred or aligned with a special interest. We want them to know when that transition is going to take place, when it's time to set down the book, turn off the TV, etc. But rather than waiting till that 0 minute to say, okay, now it's time to transition, we can allow them to see that passage of time visually. I can check in and remind them, we have 10 minutes left of this, and then it is going to be time to go eat dinner, move on to something else. Giving that transition advance notice gives that additional time for that processing to take place so that it doesn't seem as sudden or unexpected. When it comes to sensory strategies, we may need to try to provide tools, options, strategies that can address both that hyper or hypo dynamic. There are catalogs full of sensory tools that are often, unfortunately, made 2, 3, 4 times as much expensive because they are quote unquote special needs. I encourage you to keep in mind, what is the functional purpose of the item you are looking for? Is it either to block out or to deliver some form of sensory input along those 8 different senses? And things that you will find at Target, Walmart, the hardware store, Amazon, wherever, can be just as effective at doing those sort of things as something that may come out of some sort of specialty catalog. And there are tools and supports that can come from those things that can be very useful and needed, but don't default to the mindset of it has to come from there. If the purpose is to block out sound, to block out light, to deliver weight or pressure, find items that can do that task and don't feel like it has to come from somewhere where, unfortunately, they tend to gouge the different prices. Oftentimes, individuals will work with an occupational therapist to create a sensory diet. What that means is figuring out what those sensory needs are, and then rather than waiting until they are truly needed, trying to be a bit more proactive in getting them at smaller doses along the way. So they may notice that around 1 o'clock every day, it really seems like this person starts to have challenges. Well, if they've identified that they need a lot more vestibular input, let's schedule a walk around the building about 12:30 or 12:45. Let's stay ahead of that curve of sensory needs when it can be effective, but isn't quite that moment of this is a must do. Let's do it before it's even needed. Things like movement breaks, different alternative seating, different sensory tools, identifying a space that someone can go to take a break, to calm themselves down, to escape sensory input that maybe they may find aversive. And let's make sure they know where it is, and let's take them there once again before it's even needed, so that when it is, we have that strategy to fall back on. And finally, a very effective tool, once again, especially for the autistic community, but a tool that can be just as effective for truly anyone, is social narrative. What this does is creates a simple story that visually represents and explains a social situation and the expected or appropriate social behaviors that go along with it. So this helps to take those unwritten rules, that hidden curriculum, and give that information on the forefront. These tools help to connect the important details to understanding the social context. So it's important to say what to do, but also why you do that in the first place, because that's the sort of social understanding that is often missing. And no one likes to do things that they don't understand why it is they're doing it. But if we can explain why it's needed and why it's important, that can help to promote buy-in in doing those things. These are often individualized to the person it is being written for, but if you do have a group, you can start by creating one and then adapt or individualize as needed. I've seen that done quite a bit. They are written from the first person's perspective, so they will use either I, or sometimes pronouns can be confusing or get swapped within individuals. So if that is their given language ability and level, sometimes we will insert the proper noun, the name, to avoid any sort of confusion. But these combine text and pictures and is a form of providing visual support. So here's a very basic example. There's no right or wrong way to do this. You can get very creative. What makes it useful is that it meets the needs of the individual or individuals using it. So let's say I'm going to take someone or a group of people to a museum. And especially if we have not been there before, once again, that idea of accounting for the fact they may not be able to just envision or mentally imagine what to expect or how to navigate different dynamics. So in addition to visual, because once again, the adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words, I can try to describe it, but if I can also actually show you, this is what the library looks like when we walk in. This is what the restaurant looks like from the outside. That equips them with information that now they can use to inform creating that mental idea of what to anticipate. So the text here, along with the pictures, says, I am going to the museum with my group. At the museum, I will see many interesting things. While I am there, I should stay with my group. So setting that positive expectation of what to do. Accounting for the fact of, we're not trying to think of worst case scenarios, but let's think ahead and be proactive. What are things that could arise that potentially could introduce a bit of challenge? Maybe this person is very sensitive to noise. I can't control what the volume level is going to be like in the museum, but I can remind them that if it is getting too noisy, they have a strategy they can use to adapt themselves to the environment. Some items and exhibits can be touched, but others should not. So this is a social expectation that may change from room to room, or even within the same room at different exhibits. I'm going to provide them with information about this so they know to expect it, but also some strategies or tips on what to look like or how to navigate that changing social expectation during our visit. And just like I encouraged you to identify a break space, a safe space within environments that they may find themselves regularly, let's also do that in areas that we may visit less frequently or we are new to. So during the trip, if a break is needed, we have a space we can go to. Let's identify where that is and how to get there before we may experience different levels of distress. Because there's a lot of there's a big difference between approaching someone in distress and falling back on a plan we have already talked about versus saying, hey, I want you to come with me. We're going to go over there. They may not understand that you are just taking a break. Maybe they interpret that as, now I have to leave and go home. Where are we going, etc. Having a plan to fall back on, like I said, can be the difference between responding versus reacting. If you are looking for some different resources, Teresa Reagan was a keynote speaker at our annual conference a couple years ago. That was actually the last time we had our conference in person. The last 2 years, it has been virtual in conjunction with the Autism Society of Greater Wisconsin. We will be back in person this year in the Twin Cities metro area. So I'd encourage you, if you have not participated in or checked out our conference previously, it's always at the end of April. And I would encourage you to look into our keynote speakers for this year. And we will very soon be announcing all of the breakout sessions. But Dr. Reagan has published one of the most reputable books on understanding autism in adults and aging adults. Also, within the last 2 years, the Autism Society of Minnesota has helped a local self-advocate to develop and is now 2 years into, or actually 1 year into, starting the second year, a podcast focused on these sort of topics, ideas, challenges, etc. And so I would encourage you, because he has had a number of very interesting, reputable topics and speakers via any sort of streaming platform you may use, to check out today's Autistic Moment podcast for an additional learning opportunity. Finally, if you are looking for continued professional development, both of these module sets are free and very reputable. You just have to create a login account, but then they are self-guided, independent learning opportunities. If you want a deeper dive into different evidence-based practices, especially ones I've talked about, visual supports, task analysis, social narratives, things of that nature, these will walk you through learning opportunities that can help to equip you with those sort of tools that you can use to support individuals within your communities. At this time, I open it up for and welcome your questions, comments, feedback. We have just under about 10 minutes left here, but please do let me know, especially in the chat, or if you would like to unmute as well. Any questions you might have, this would be the time to do so.
Well, not hearing any questions, and please, if anyone does have a question, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me. But Eric, thank you so much. I feel like you've given us such a great foundation, but I also realize that we're just scratching the surface. And so I appreciate your wealth of knowledge and your background, and the really great presentation you were able to offer us today. And that was just awesome. I appreciate it greatly.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity as well. You know, there's a number of interesting dynamics and topics within the world of autism and the autistic community, but I would say this is one of them, in addition to a few others that I really enjoy the opportunity to speak to, and hopefully you can see I have a fair amount of passion, because I do see this as something that, whether we act or not, is only going to become more and more of a consideration, a need, a challenge. And if we don't take steps now, those needs and challenges are only going to be exacerbated. So I encourage you to take this understanding that you have, that you've built on or is new to you, and find ways to share some of this with others, or seek opportunities as you can to really advocate not only for the autistic community as a whole, but also for the idea that there are many autistic adults in our communities that likely have not been diagnosed, that may not have supports, and as they continue to age, supporting aging adults with autism is not going to be necessarily one and the same as supporting neurotypical aging adults, but also there is overlap, and especially many of these strategies can be just as effective for aging individuals who may not have autism. There's a lot of universal design to these things. If you can address and support the autism community by a default, you can support and address a wide variety of the needs that you may find in other communities as well. So from that sense, you can get kind of a lot of bang for your buck for any sort of work and efforts that go into these areas.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciated the course, the Webster. It was amazing. And I think what you just said is absolutely right. You have opened up our communications with other people also. We can do better communication by, all the knowledge that you have provided us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I do see the comment in here about supporting individuals with gambling addictions, and there's a number of interesting overlaps with, we looked at some of those co-occurring kind of mental health considerations, but getting into gambling addictions, I know that podcast I just referenced, not necessarily gambling addictions per se, but he just did a 2-part series on chemical dependency and addiction. And there are interesting areas of crossover. To kind of paraphrase or give just a quick bit of feedback, a lot of times it has to do with that very hyper-focused, high interest sort of areas. And there are autistic individuals who can have things like substance use, gambling become a bit of that fixated interest. Also, those that may not have diagnosed autism, that's kind of where that overlap often stems from, is that idea of very narrow, very high interest sort of areas. And there's also very interesting things coming out in the realm of different eating disorders, and how while they may not be diagnosed autistic, there is a lot of overlap and a lot of similarities and autistic tendencies amongst individuals that may experience or be trying to navigate different eating related disorders. So as you can see here, the other resources listed, feel free to check out our website for other learning opportunities to see things that we may be doing. And then also I've included my email here if you do want to reach out to me directly.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to learn more. Again, we've got some other webinars coming up in the future. You can check us out on facebook.com/Arrowhead AAA, and I put that in the chat to learn more about future webinars. We've got one coming up next month on advanced planning, and then some other ones coming up on renters' rights and on spending down to public programs. So we really encourage you to stop back and keep checking in to see what new things we've got we're able to offer. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of the holiday season. Everyone stay safe.
Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.